Tonight at 10, Boris Johnson is no longer Conservative leader, but he wants to stay on as Prime Minister until a successor is chosen. In a statement that made no mention of his recent difficulties, Mr. Johnson seemed to blame his colleagues for withdrawing their support.
As we've seen at Westminster, the herd instinct is powerful. When the herd moves, it moves. And my friends, in politics, no one is remotely indispensable.
Watched by his family and his most loyal supporters, Mr. Johnson expressed regret that his premiership will be ending much earlier than he'd hoped.
I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks.
In recent days, no fewer than 58 Conservative MPs had left the government from senior to junior levels, raising doubts about the government's ability to function. Now, live at Westminster tonight, they were taking in the news. Labour said Mr. Johnson's intention to stay on as Prime Minister over the summer was not acceptable.
It's obvious he's unfit to be Prime Minister. That's been blindingly obvious for a very, very long time. And if they don't get rid of him, then Labour will step up in the national interest and bring a vote of no confidence.
An argument has raged all day about just how long Boris Johnson can stay here in Downing Street. Tonight he is promising that any big decisions will be left to the next Prime Minister.
Yes, more from Chris in just a moment, and we will indeed be asking if Mr. Johnson is now going to come under increasing pressure to move out of number 10 as soon as possible. Also on the programme. In relation to the war in Ukraine, President Putin dares the West to have a go at defeating Russia on the battlefield. And an injured Rafael Nadal withdraws from Wimbledon, missing an opportunity to achieve a new Grand Slam record.
And stay with us on BBC News for continuing coverage and analysis from our team of correspondents in the UK and around the world.
Welcome to BBC News at 10. Boris Johnson is no longer leader of the Conservative Party, but he's still Prime Minister and he intends to stay in charge until a successor is chosen. Now, Mr. Johnson delivered a statement outside number 10 Downing Street at lunchtime today in which he appeared to blame what he called the herd instinct of Conservative MPs for forcing him out. Many of his colleagues, along with opposition parties, are deeply unhappy with his plans to stay on as Prime Minister over the summer, and they've called on him to go immediately. But Mr. Johnson has now gone ahead and he has filled vacant posts in his cabinet, appointing 6 new members. And there they are, from left to right. We start with Greg Clark, who's come back into the cabinet. He's now the Levelling Up Secretary. And then a big pal of Boris Johnson's, James Cleverly, going to education. Robert Buckland has become the new Welsh Secretary. Shailesh Vara there is going to the Northern Ireland office. Another Boris Johnson loyal fan is Kit Malthouse, who's been appointed to the Cabinet Office. And then we have, on the right there, Andrew Stevenson, an additional minister who's attending the Cabinet. He's called a minister without portfolio. Now, the final unravelling of Mr. Johnson's leadership happened in the past few days with the resignations of Sajid Javid and Rishi Sunak, and then followed by an additional 56 departures from different levels of government. And tonight we'll be asking, how realistic is it for the Prime Minister to stay on for another 3 months or so? And we'll be looking at the likely candidates to succeed him. So first tonight, let's join our political editor, Chris Mason, in Downing Street.
Huw, this time last night you and I were in conversation here in Downing Street, reflecting, weren't we, on the brutal exercise of prime ministerial power from Boris Johnson with the sacking of a senior cabinet minister. There was a swagger from Downing Street and a determination and a defiance to carry on. How things changed. This morning there was a stony silence. I was calling people in this building from around about 6:30 this morning. Not a single call or text or WhatsApp was replied to until around 9 o'clock. Why? Because Boris Johnson and his advisors were in there in private contemplating his future, and shortly after 9 o'clock we learnt he was leaving. At breakfast time, there was talk of a constitutional crisis, a Prime Minister who wouldn't budge, and more ministers resigning. But just after 9 o'clock, news Boris Johnson would resign today. This, the most powerful street in the country, suddenly packed. Those arriving for work here capturing the moment too. At lunchtime, a lectern. Those normally inside, outside. An audience awaits. And then a moment at once personal, political and constitutional.
Hi, everybody. It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister. So I want to say to the millions of people who voted for us in 2019, many of them voting Conservative for the first time, thank you for that incredible mandate. And the reason I have fought so hard in the last few days to continue to deliver that mandate in person was not just because I wanted to do so, but because I felt it was my job, my duty, my obligation to you to continue to do what we promised in 2019.
He fought hard and lost, his cabinet and his party abandoning him, but listen still to his defiance.
In the last few days, I've tried to persuade my colleagues that it would be eccentric to change governments when we're delivering so much.
This was Boris Johnson forced to articulate that his imagined future here was being crushed. The boy who dreamed of being world king, ejected.
As we've seen at Westminster, the herd instinct is powerful. When the herd moves, it moves. And my friends, in politics, no one is remotely indispensable. I know that there will be many people who are relieved, and perhaps quite a few who will also be disappointed. And I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks.
That's life, Mr. Johnson acknowledging. A painful personal moment, a splash of history unfolding too.
Being Prime Minister is an education in itself. I've travelled to every part of the United Kingdom, and in addition to the beauty of our natural world, I've found so many people possessed of such boundless British originality and so willing to tackle old problems in new ways that I know that even if things can sometimes seem dark now, our future together is golden. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
What a moment. A man who won a big majority at a general election just 2.5 years ago is going, humiliated by his party. The Boris Johnson era will soon be over. Liar! Few are indifferent to Boris Johnson, a primary colours Prime Minister, provoking colourful reactions to the near end.
A great man brought down. A great man brought down. That's all I can say at the moment. Thank you.
The country will rue this day.
They'll regret it like they did with Thatcher. Exactly. Yes, this will be a mistake.
But plenty of others within the Conservative Party and beyond think Boris Johnson should be standing down as Prime Minister pretty much immediately, and not just as Conservative leader. The former Prime Minister Sir John Major is among them. In a letter he wrote, the proposal for the Prime Minister to remain in office is unwise and maybe unsustainable. For the overall well-being of the country, Mr Johnson should not remain in Downing Street for any longer than necessary to effect the smooth transition of government. Sir John suggested that the Deputy Prime Minister could take over for a bit, or a caretaker Prime Minister could be drafted in. Would Theresa May fancy it?
Look, from everything I hear, and I haven't obviously heard recently, I don't think there's going to be a caretaker Prime Minister in the sense of somebody else coming in to that role.
And what does an opposition party leader do on a day like this? Well, one option is to smile and go and watch some tennis at Wimbledon, having said this about Boris Johnson.
He needs to go completely. None of this nonsense about clinging on for a few months. He's inflicted lies, fraud and chaos in the country. And, you know, We're stuck with a government which isn't functioning.
There will be an overwhelming and very widespread sense of relief today that Boris Johnson's time as Prime Minister, which should probably never have been allowed to happen in the first place, is coming to an end.
The problem is the Conservative Party, Conservative MPs have stood by him for so long. They propped him up. They enabled him to fail to lead our country properly. And my heart goes out to the millions of families and pensioners who've not been helped properly because his government has been so incompetent.
Attention now turns to those who aspire to come next in Downing Street, a fourth Prime Minister in a little over 6 years.
Are you going to make a bid for the leadership, sir?
There's the former Chancellor. The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss is likely to be in the picture.
Good morning.
And perhaps the former Cabinet Minister Jeremy Hunt too, among others. A beauty pageant to lead the country is only just beginning. And after the intrigue and anguish, plotting and resignations, a leader departs soonish.
Chris's account of the day's events there. Let's join him back in Downing Street. Can we talk, Chris, about the manner of Boris Johnson's departure when it happened, and then, of course, this row about whether he should be staying on as Prime Minister for a few more months?
Yeah, what was striking, Huw, I thought, in the immediate hours after the news that Boris Johnson was going to resign was the anger from quite a few Conservative MPs when they learnt that he would stick on for a few months whilst there was that leadership race. And that anger for some intensified because they felt there wasn't exactly skipfuls of mea culpa from Boris Johnson in that resignation speech. But the mechanisms for dislodging a Prime Minister, as opposed to a Conservative leader, are actually pretty limited. There's a nuclear option, which would be a vote of confidence in the whole government. But if Conservative MPs were to endorse that, they would bring forward a general election. And given that they currently don't have a party leader and their opinion poll ratings aren't great from their perspective, that might not be that tempting an option. The other thing that is a movable feast this summer is just how long the Conservative leadership race lasts. The predictions on that range from about 3 months to 3 weeks.
Chris, thank you. And we'll talk about possible successors a little later on. But Chris Mason, thanks very much. Now, Boris Johnson's premiership has, as we know, been marked by controversy pretty much since he entered number 10. But his confused handling of allegations of sexual misconduct involving the former minister, Chris Pincher, was the final straw for many of his colleagues. And that seemed to crystallise many of the questions about trust and integrity which have haunted Mr Johnson during his time in office. Vicky Young has this analysis.
I want to talk to the crowd. Riding high and doing what he did best. Boris Johnson on the campaign trail persuading millions to back Brexit. Many credit or blame him for the victory that followed.
The bastion of independence.
He was a leading contender to replace David Cameron when he resigned after the referendum. But a close ally decided to publicly voice concerns about Mr Johnson's flaws.
I've realised that while Boris does have those very special abilities to communicate and to reach out, what he did not have was the capacity to build and to lead that team and to provide the leadership the country needs at this critical moment.
It was an early warning from someone who knew him well. He abandoned his campaign, leaving loyal supporters distraught. But his ambitions weren't thwarted for long. Theresa May's Brexit plans hit the buffers, and Tory MPs saw him as the man to get it done. He entered Downing Street with a team willing to ignore the usual conventions of politics. At the time, many MPs were determined to stop the UK leaving the EU without a deal. Mr Johnson asked the Queen to suspend Parliament, a move deemed unlawful in the Supreme Court, and kicked more than 20 Tory MPs out of the party. David Gauke was one of them.
He was prepared to adopt tactics that other prime ministers would not have adopted, prepared to use language that other prime ministers would not have been prepared to adopt. Basically because he felt that the rules didn't apply to him. And the problem is that the approach that he took over Brexit is also the approach that he has taken over other matters, personal as well as policy.
To break the deadlock, an election was called, and the Conservatives won their biggest majority in more than 30 years. For his new government, though, everything was put on hold when it was hit by the worst health crisis in modern times.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
The Prime Minister himself became seriously ill with COVID.
I still have a temperature.
He was admitted to intensive care and spent 3 days in hospital. A key ally throughout this time was Dominic Cummings. His unconventional style aggravated many.
Sorry I'm late.
And within a year of the election victory, he'd resigned after a bitter power struggle, clashing with Tory MPs and the Prime Minister's wife. He soon went on the attack, becoming Mr Johnson's fiercest and most damaging critic.
He doesn't have a plan, he doesn't know how to be Prime Minister, and we'd only got him in there because we had to solve a certain problem, not because we thought that he was the right person to be running the country.
Mr Johnson was criticised by his ethics advisor over the complicated funding of a lavish flat refurbishment. He infuriated colleagues by trying to water down rules on standards in public life to help a colleague, only to U-turn later.
What have you done to this place?
A heavy by-election defeat to the Liberal Democrats was the first sign that voters weren't impressed.
Fundamentally, Boris came to Downing Street without an ideology, without a strategy and without a plan, then chose the wrong strategists around him. And I think that every time he got busted, rather than owning up to it, he did the usual Boris thing, which is to say, well, I'm not going to apologise and I'm not going to change and we're going to ride it out. He was kind of tied down by his own character. And in the end, actually, he proved quite inflexible.
Last year, stories started leaking out about rule-breaking parties in Number 10, while the rest of the country was in lockdown. After a police investigation, Mr Johnson was fined for a birthday celebration in the Cabinet Room. Altogether, over 120 fines were issued to staff. A report by a senior civil servant blamed a failure of leadership, and Mr Johnson was accused of lying about what went on. The final straw was a chaotic response to allegations of sexual misconduct against the Deputy Chief Whip, Chris Pincher. Mr Johnson was again accused of not being upfront about what he knew. For some, though, there is a legacy to be proud of.
I think we do need to recognise that he delivered on his promise to get Brexit done, and he got us through the pandemic with the most successful vaccination programme in Europe. So there is much to be positive about.
For many of Mr Johnson's colleagues, though, his downfall has not come as a surprise. Vicky Young, BBC News, Westminster.
So, as Vicky was explaining, all of that now has led to this Conservative Party leadership contest. And Chris Mason said a short while ago, didn't he, that estimates of the kind of length of time that this will take vary from 3 months, I think he said, down to 3 weeks. Well, 3 weeks might be rather ambitious when we think about the process involved, because the timetable, the essential timetable, will be set on Monday by the leadership of the 1922 committee. That's the committee of backbench Conservative MPs. They run this process. And then once that's been set, the rules state, and the rules of course can change, but the rules state that 8 MPs at least need to nominate. They need to support one candidate. You'll need 8 MPs to be behind you to get onto the ballot paper. Then a series of votes among the MPs will take place, whittling them all down to candidates on a final piece of paper with just 2 names on it. And then those 2 names will go forward to the party members, all of the Conservative Party members, around 200,000 of them, who will then choose the new leader. Now, given the numbers involved and what the process involved, well, you can imagine that 3 weeks would be an incredibly difficult thing to achieve if all of those stages are to be gone through. And indeed, we already have people being talked about as potential candidates, quite a few of them already being talked about today, as my colleague Ben Wright tells us now.
At Cabinet on Tuesday, Boris Johnson was circled by possible successors. Some have been campaigning quietly for months, eyeing up the top job, waiting for the gun to be fired. You could be hearing a lot from these names over the summer. The next Prime Minister will be picked by the Tory party, and it's likely to be a crowded field with no obvious front runner. So who might enter the race? Well, there's Rishi Sunak, Chancellor of the Exchequer until he quit on Tuesday. He is believed to be putting a leadership team together, but some Tory MPs are cross he didn't cut taxes. Sajid Javid has stood for leader before and was the first cabinet minister to resign this week. The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has never hidden her intentions. She voted Remain in 2016 but has been a fierce defender of Brexit ever since. The grassroots seem to like her. Penny Mordaunt is a Royal Navy reservist and Defence Secretary under Theresa May, now widely thought to be gunning for the top job. And there's Nadhim Zahawi, appointed Chancellor this week and ambitious, as they all are. The government's top legal officer, Suella Braverman, has already put her hat in the ring and was gently teased about it by Labour.
And can I say, what an honour it is to be at this dispatch box facing the next Prime Minister as she waits her call from the palace.
General. I know the Right Honourable really loves to degrade these question sessions to petty politics. I'm not going to lower myself to her standards.
The list goes on. There's a lot of chat about Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, and Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary, is also seriously considering a run for leader. Then there are the dark horses. Backbencher Tom Tugendhat launches his leadership bid in tomorrow's Daily Telegraph. How are you? And there are more.
I've had enough experience within government to know I can chair the meetings, I can lead the people, I have the ideas, I can mobilise Secretaries of State to do what needs to be done. I'm absolutely confident if I seized power, I'd do a good job.
Boris Johnson plans to stick around as Prime Minister while Tory MPs and party members plough through the process of picking a new leader. But the rules for this election are not nailed down yet, and there are Tory MPs who want to see Mr Johnson out sooner.
I think what we need to do is appoint a caretaker this weekend, somebody who won't run to be leader. I really worry otherwise we're going to get into a febrile, hot July coronation of somebody in a hurry.
And are you going to have a crack at it?
No, I won't be running, but I will be working this summer to make sure we get the right person. This is crucial. We're in the last chance saloon. This party's packed with talent. The public haven't seen enough of it.
Restoring some calm after the chaos, rebuilding trust in political standards. The candidates will argue about the direction of the Tory party, but they will all agree the culture of leadership has to change. Ben Wright, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, this time last night, the Prime Minister's allies were letting it be known that he intended to stay as party leader and Prime Minister because he considered that the Conservative election victory back in December 2019 was in many ways a personal achievement, a personal thumbs up from the voters, if you like. One English seat that has returned a Conservative MP to Westminster for over a century is Macclesfield in Cheshire, in the northwest of England, and our special correspondent Ed Thomas has been talking to some of the people there.
The truest and bluest of Tory safe seats. Macclesfield, a town loyal to the party for 100 years. But today,
Boris Johnson resigning, it's over.
Why did it take so long? Why did it take so long?
I was dancing in the kitchen, yeah. I bought a bottle of Carver to celebrate tonight. It's going in the fridge.
John and Joe on grandparent duty and planning a leaving do.
What do you think of the man?
Narcissistic, psychopathic, selfish, boorish.
If Boris Johnson was here now, in Cheshire, what would you say to him?
You've been an embarrassment for many years and your incompetence has caught up with you.
Millions and millions of people voted for the Conservatives and Boris Johnson in 2019. They wanted him.
They voted on a promise of something that was not going to materialise.
Boris Johnson, he's going. What's the reaction?
Terrible. Terrible.
Tough to hear for some loyalists like Anne and Julie.
I think it's a shame that he's left. And I don't think it's that sensible.
You're part of these 14 million who've said, I want Boris Johnson.
The 14 million should get together and descend on London.
Listening in is Edward, 78, a paid-up member of the Conservatives, and furious.
Block the town up and tell them, we voted for him, we want him kept.
Sounds a bit Donald Trump-esque.
No, it's not.
The only one I would vote for in the Tory party was Boris.
Despite all the apologies, despite the misleading of Parliament, despite the parties, despite everything, you want him to stay?
Yeah, I do. That's the only reason I voted for him, because of the character of him.
But listen to the relief of best friends Anne and Anne.
Boris Johnson's gone.
Buffoon.
liar. Get out. Each time there's been something that he's done and he's survived, and you start to lose faith in the whole system.
Yes. Because Piglet, they call him, and that is so apt, isn't it?
Piglet.
You couldn't go on any longer?
No, I couldn't.
Being a Conservative member?
No, I couldn't stomach it, Ed. I'd had enough.
Former Conservative councillor Andrew Gregory, so disillusioned in Boris Johnson, he quit.
I will not be rejoining the party. I'm so disappointed with the things that I've seen happen.
Millions of people put their faith in Boris Johnson.
Indeed.
In working class communities.
Yeah.
They wanted levelling up.
Yeah, I wonder whether if the vote came again, they'd have that same certainty and satisfaction in that individual.
The new chapter will soon begin, but will old divisions remain? Thomas, BBC News, Macclesfield.
Well, now, the change that will happen in Downing Street has profound implications for all parts of the UK, of course, and Mr Johnson's resignation comes at a very challenging time in Northern Ireland, especially with controversial legislation going through Westminster designed to override parts of the post-Brexit trading arrangements. With me in the studio, our Ireland correspondent Emma Vardy. So, this change, and of course, we don't know who's going to succeed Mr Johnson, but the change in itself and the kind of uncertainty that creates, what impact does that have on politics and arrangements in Northern Ireland?
Well, look, none of the political parties in Northern Ireland were fans of Boris Johnson. They'd all been critical of him. But it creates particularly more uncertainty here because Northern Ireland is in the middle of a political crisis of its own. It hasn't had a fully functioning government since February, and getting one back is hanging on resolving problems with the Brexit arrangements. The Northern Ireland Protocol, which has created a new trade border in the Irish Sea. Now, the DUP said it won't go back into Stormont unless that is removed. And the party saw Boris Johnson as their best chance for pushing through controversial legislation to override parts of those Brexit agreements. So with Boris Johnson gone now, that all feels much more in doubt. They saw him as the person who would push through that legislation, despite there being critics who say, look, this goes against international law. So it adds uncertainty in Northern Ireland. The question for a new Prime Minister will be, do they continue in that vein, or do they take a more conciliatory tack with the EU?
OK, Emma, many thanks again for that. Emma Vardy, our Ireland correspondent there. Now, that's the view in Northern Ireland. There's a sharp focus too in the devolved governments in Scotland and Wales. And in a moment we'll be hearing from Hywel Griffith in Cardiff. But first, let's join James Shaw in Glasgow.
Well, relief is a word that a lot of people across the political spectrum have been using in Scotland today. Relief that Boris Johnson is going, and that was echoed by Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister. She said she thought that would be widespread, but not according to the Scottish Secretary, Alistair Jack, Boris Johnson's man in Scotland, who has stuck with him really right to the end. There is one outstanding question. What happens to Nicola Sturgeon's idea of an independence referendum next October? In theory, a new Prime Minister might take a different view from Boris Johnson, who rejected it, but in reality it is very hard to see any Conservative Prime Minister of the United Kingdom saying yes to a referendum anytime soon. Support for Boris Johnson in Wales evaporated remarkably quickly. Late last night, the usually loyal Welsh Secretary Simon Hart resigned. His replacement, Robert Buckland, only took the job, we're told, because Boris Johnson was going to quit. When exactly he'll leave is still an open question. The leader of the Welsh Conservatives in the Senedd here says he'd be happy for Boris Johnson to stay over the summer, pointing to his legacy. It's worth noting how well the Welsh Conservatives did under Boris Johnson in 2019, grabbing a fistful of Labour seats. So the challenge for the next leader is, how do they persuade those first-time Welsh Tory voters to stay with them in constituencies like Wrexham, Delyn and Bridgend? The other challenge is resetting the relationship with the Welsh Government, a Labour administration. So of course they're rivals, but things have been very fractious of late, not least with politicians here in Cardiff Bay claiming the UK government has been grabbing back power and deliberately disrespecting the devolution settlement.
That was Howell Griffith there in Cardiff Bay, and then we had James Shaw before that in Glasgow. Now, one of the most important issues facing the new Prime Minister, whenever he or she takes office, will be the crisis around the cost of living, and it's a growing crisis. Today, the independent forecaster, the Office for Budget Responsibility, warned that debt in the UK is on an unsustainable path unless spending is tightened and taxes are raised. Now, our economics editor, Faisal Islam, is with me here to explain a little more. Faisal.
Yes, Huw, the government's own forecasters have a central message. There's not enough money to fund services for an ageing society over the next 50 years, leading to massive government debts unless something is done. This is down to several things: a slower growing economy, a declining workforce and population. At the same time, spending is set to shoot up on the NHS, social care and pensions as society ages. For example, now we spend less than a fifth of the value of the whole economy on a combination of health, social care and spending. That's in the yellow, black and red boxes. But over 50 years, that's rising closer to a third. That's hundreds of billions of pounds. And if we have fewer workers and therefore less tax coming in as predicted, that means a borrowing time bomb. So here's one stark example of why there'll be less tax coming in. Fuel and excise duty as one example. The government would expect to get a huge amount here, about £30 billion a year, the blue line there. But because of the phasing out of petrol engines in favour of electric cars, that revenue is heading to, well, zero. Will it be replaced? Can it be replaced? And yet right now, in the argument over who becomes Prime Minister, the pressure is to offer immediate tax cuts or not to go through with planned tax rises. How much of all this will be tackled by the candidates hoping to be the next Prime Minister? Let's see. Back to you, Huw.
Faisal, many thanks. Faisal Islam there, our economics editor, with thoughts on the economic challenge for the new Prime Minister. Now, throughout his premiership, Boris Johnson has been seeking to promote an image of a globally significant UK on the world stage, and it's a policy closely linked to his support for Brexit. And the most obvious example of a global role so far has been in Ukraine, arguably. Now, our diplomatic correspondent Caroline Hawley looks at Mr Johnson's reputation beyond the shores of the United Kingdom.
Boris Johnson serait donc sur le point de démissionner.
The British government is in turmoil this morning. Prime Minister Boris Johnson, a key ally, announces that he is resigning.
The downfall of Boris Johnson has made international headlines. The Prime Minister, who as a child wanted to be king of the world, who took the UK out of the EU and promoted the country as global Britain.
It is time to change the record, to recover our natural and historic role as an enterprising, outward-looking and truly global Britain, generous in temper and engaged with the world.
The crisis in Ukraine has provided Boris Johnson an opportunity to show British generosity. The UK was the first European country to send arms, with cross-party support. But as support for his leadership at home drained away, Ukraine appeared for him a welcome distraction. In President Zelensky, he found a grateful ally, who today expressed sadness.
Thank you, Boris Johnson, for understanding the threat of the Russian monster and always being at the forefront of supporting Ukraine.
Moscow, by contrast, gloated, with one official saying he'd been hit by his own boomerang.
We have a deal with the EU that is ready to go. It is oven ready, as I never tire of it.
Brexit had propelled Boris Johnson to power. He got his deal, but his plan to override parts of it brought fury in European capitals. And there are few tears being shed in most of Europe tonight at his demise.
Great progress, so it's an honour to have you here. We're going to be discussing trade. We can quadruple our trade with UK.
Boris Johnson has drawn comparisons with Donald Trump, both populist, controversial leaders. Despite the smiles, relations with Joe Biden are cooler, with no trade deal in sight, and concerns in Washington over Northern Ireland.
I think he's seen as a big and charismatic personality, but I'm afraid one that could not be trusted to stick to deals. His word was not his bond. We are now a country which unilaterally rips up international agreements. I think we're diminished on the international stage, and there's ground to be made up.
Boris Johnson relished the world stage. He's reordered British foreign policy, but there are, to put it mildly, decidedly mixed views of his overall performance and of the legacy he'll leave. Caroline Hawley, BBC News.
Well, let's talk a little more about the latest on the conflict in Ukraine, because earlier tonight, speaking about the conflict, President Putin dared the West to take on Russian forces on the battlefield. Let's join our correspondent Huw Edwards, who's in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. And Joe, is it fair to say that this contribution by President Putin was quite a belligerent one?
Yes, it certainly was. This was a hawkish speech delivered to a very well-receiving audience in the form of the Duma, and he basically was issuing a challenge to the West. He said, if you think you can take Russia on the battlefield, well, bring it on. He also suggested that the West was happy to fight to the very last Ukrainian, something he said was a tragedy for this country. I think the most striking thing, though, was the suggestion by Vladimir Putin that what he calls his special military operation had not even begun in earnest. Now, that will come as something of a surprise to people here in Ukraine, where 20% of the territory is already occupied. Now, indeed, this speech has been dismissed by a presidential advisor here who said it was for an internal audience only.
Joe, many thanks for the latest there in Kyiv. That's our correspondent, Huw Edwards. Well, let's change direction completely and talk about the tennis. The two-time men's champion Rafael Nadal has pulled out of Wimbledon. The second seed was on course for a record 23 Grand Slam title, 23rd Grand Slam title, and he's been forced to withdraw because of an injury. Our sports correspondent Joe Wilson rounds up the day's news from there.
He came to Wimbledon to practice, to try, but a glimpse of Rafael Nadal's torso, however sculpted, reveals the problem. Do you see the tape on there? An abdominal tear obviously hampered him during his quarter-final. He'd considered retiring during that match, but 24 hours later, he'd run out of options.
It's obvious that if I keep going, the injury gonna be worse and worse, and that's the thing that I can say now, and feel very sad to say that.
Nadal first won Wimbledon in 2008, then again in 2010. His 2 Grand Slam titles this year took his total to 22. But the most successful men's player ever has to manage his career, and thus reluctantly withdraws. There are immediate consequences here. Nick Kyrgios, with no semi-final opponent, is through to his first Grand Slam final. Cameron Norrie looked fit and well on the practice courts, preparing for the biggest match of his life, the semi-final that remains, against Novak Djokovic, who's perfectly familiar with these occasions. And remember, he's chasing Nadal's all-time record of Grand Slam titles. 2 players are left in the women's singles. Ons Jabeur of Tunisia beat her friend Tatiana Maria of Germany in their semi-final. Jabeur is the first African woman to reach the Wimbledon final in the Open era. In the final, she'll play Elena Rybakina of Kazakhstan, who overpowered Simona Halep. One trophy has already been lifted. Britain's Neil Skupski with American Desiree Kravchuk won the mixed doubles, defending their title. Wimbledon loves to see champions come back.
Thank you very much for everything.
Rafa Nadal will be 37 next summer. Does he, do we, dare look that far ahead? Joe Wilson, BBC News, Wimbledon.
Let's talk then about football. In Northern Ireland, the lowest ranked team to qualify for the Women's Euro finals got off to a difficult start tonight against the former European champions Norway. Northern Ireland were beaten 4-1 and they're playing in Southampton. Jane Dougal has this report.
A first major tournament. Some have known nothing else. Others have suffered years of disappointment. But now all young fans can picture themselves playing for their country.
I really hoped that I would become a professional footballer, so that's my dream, probably hers as well.
Yeah, definitely.
I said to my granddaughter there, Molly, if they qualified last year, I would take her to the Euros.
They're showing what our wee country is capable of.
What's incredible is that the Northern Ireland players are not professional. They all have day jobs. The squad is made up of NHS staff, teachers and shop workers who now all have the hopes of a nation resting on their shoulders.
Walking out to make history, the debutants under the watchful eye of their seasoned manager. Could the sisters in arms complete the fairy tale? After 9 minutes, it seemed unlikely. Norway looking organised. A second swiftly followed and Northern Ireland were defending for their lives.
Brilliant block!
But an arm in the box led to a penalty, decisively struck. The second half saw a sharper Northern Ireland. From a corner, the veteran Julie Nelson got her head on the ball.
And Northern Ireland have scored!
Sending the crowd into raptures. The euphoria didn't last long. A beautifully placed free kick brought them back down to earth. A predictable loss perhaps, but this night won't be remembered for the scoreline. Instead, the fans will hold on to the memory of a first international tournament goal for Northern Ireland women. Jane Dougal, BBC News, Southampton.
Well, now, before we go, let's return to Westminster. It's 20 to 11, a bit later than planned because, of course, we've been reporting on all today's developments. So after that resignation announcement by Boris Johnson today, let's rejoin our political editor, Chris Mason. I said earlier, Chris, we talk about possible successors. How can you help us with that?
Well, Boris Johnson climbed high, didn't he, Huw, and fell fast. A convention-smashing, rule-bending, first-name recognition Prime Minister. And the party now looks for a successor, and in all likelihood will look for a successor of very different character. But beyond that, there is then likely to be an intense discussion within the Conservative Party about what being a Conservative in 2022 actually feels like. That discussion is already underway. The leadership campaigns are already up and running. I was talking to a cabinet minister at lunchtime, midway through the chat. Their phone was ringing and one of the likely candidates was ringing them. So we'll see that step up in the coming days. The question then is how long it takes. Is it something that MPs here at Westminster can decide amongst themselves, or does it go out to the wider Conservative Party membership? A tiny slither of the population at large, 100,000 or so people, deciding on behalf of the rest of us who our next Prime Minister will be.
Chris, many thanks again. Chris there with the final word at Downing Street tonight, our political editor. So with the time just about creeping up to 11:15, let's have a look at the weather. And Louise is here. Hi, Louise.
Hi there, Huw. Started off a bit ropey this morning. A lot of cloud around, wasn't there? But look at this. Once that sunshine comes through, it's certainly got some strength in it now at this time of year. So we saw highs this afternoon, can you believe it, of 27 Celsius. That's 80 Fahrenheit in Kew. The best of the weather certainly out to the east. The best of the sunshine in terms of volume. Nearly 14 hours of sunshine in Edinburgh at this afternoon. But not all of Scotland saw some sunshine. There was quite a lot of cloud around as well. As you can see here from this satellite picture from earlier on, the cloud thick enough at the moment to produce a little bit of drizzle as well to the far north and west of the Great Glen. It's this frontal system here that's toppling across the high pressure. The high pressure still really in the driving seat, still keeping things pretty quiet over the next few days. But yes, we've got some cloud over the next few hours, and yes, we've got that drizzle. Elsewhere, a little bit of cloud across northwest England and Northern Ireland, but a mild start. Temperatures widely starting off at around mid-teens first thing on Friday morning. So mild and warm and dry and sunny. That's going to be the theme as we move in towards the weekend. Yes, still this nuisance frontal system producing that little patchy drizzle here and there. But elsewhere, with the best of the sunshine, we've got the warmth as well. We're looking at highs of 21, 22 degrees in eastern Scotland. Highs of 28 degrees. That's 82 Fahrenheit perhaps out to the east. And so that means we might have to keep an eye on the UV levels. Certainly worth bearing in mind if you're going to be out and about for any length of time. We've not had to think about that for quite some time, have we? But as we move into the weekend, you'll certainly need to continue to think about it. The high stays with us. The frontal systems move a little bit further north, so even areas that have stayed pretty cloudy and grey so far this week will actually improve into the weekend, and it's going to get warmer still. Temperatures potentially peaking at 30 degrees. What do you think, Huw?
Factor 50 out, I reckon, Louise. Thank you very much. Always for me anyway. Thanks a lot. Thanks to Louise there with the weather. And Newsnight, it's already started some time ago on BBC Two. And here on BBC One, we'll be joining our news teams in the nations and regions in just a second. But we'll leave you tonight with some key words and images from the past 2.5 years of Boris Johnson's rather turbulent time as Prime Minister. Have a good night.
We're going to come out of the EU, no ifs or buts. Wonderful to see this new team assembled here. to Rishi.
There. He's going to be a fantastic Prime Minister, I can tell you.
The decision to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament was unlawful.
You must stay at home. I've developed mild symptoms of the coronavirus. The NHS has saved my life, no question. GPs are doing an incredible job of getting those jabs into people's arms.
Yes!
So now I went, as we all must, to Peppa Pig World.
Yes?
Mr. Speaker, I want to apologise. I've received a fixed penalty notice from the Metropolitan Police. Above all, I want to thank you, the British public, for the immense privilege that you have given me. Thank you all very much. Thank you.